Would you describe yourself as a patient man when it comes to negotiations?
I'm not naturally a patient person, but patience is something that I've had to learn. And I think the mistakes that I've made, and I've made many, have partly been the product of impatience. Pushing too hard, not thinking creatively enough about what other routes might have been followed, how else one might have done it, and not allowing myself to get provoked personally. I think the social contract discussions in that regard in particular, which were really long. I mean, they went on for a long time. I mean, we had preparatory discussions with the public sector unions. We were talking through the issues about how the province's financial situation. I brought in Premier Blakeney to talk to some of the senior leadership of the cabinet and of the labor movement, and really tried to develop an understanding about it. And
was that a helpful thing to do?
Yeah, but it was helpful, but in the end it wasn't successful. I mean, we had to legislate, which I didn't really want to do, and had hoped that the unions would see their way clear. But the union experience there really taught me something that I think is really an important lesson in negotiation. And somebody said this to me once, and I didn't really take it seriously enough. And now, after that experience, I thought long and hard about it. And it is this, is you can't ask someone to do something which they actually can't do. I mean, it sounds very obvious, but particularly in labor negotiations, if you're saying to somebody, I want you to come in and I want you to negotiate a reduction in your members' wages, they can't do that. They just say, I can't do that. Maybe circumstances will eventually force me to do that, but I would only do, I mean, the reality is I'd only do it in the face of unbelievably difficult alternatives. But don't ask me to come in out of the blue and say, oh, guess what, this year instead of negotiating a raise, I'm going to be negotiating a reduction. And I think that in that case, I think it was difficult for the union leadership, and I wasn't sufficiently respectful of the challenges that they faced to say, well, this is what we're going to do. I was too much aware of the challenges that I faced, which is the fact that the province was
in serious situation.
Serious financial situation, not an impossible situation, but one in which the better route was for people to take a little less so that we could see our way clear to maintaining employment in the public sector for the next 3 years, which is what I wanted to do. I didn't want to lay people off. And I think I think it was a worthy objective, but I think that I did have to learn patience. I hope I'm not exaggerating when I say I'm less impatient now as I've been through what I've been through than I might have been at another time. The other thing is that it sometimes you can't get an agreement, and you then have to say, well, we've tried this and it hasn't worked, and so here's the alternatives as to what will happen, and that's always painful. But you sometimes have to recognize that you'll only get an agreement when the parties perceive that circumstances have changed, and they will then appreciate the change in circumstances.
How would you describe your communication style over the years? When you look at what's happening now, you have the internet, you have text, people are exchanging documents almost instantaneously. What's your type of communication
Well, the first thing
style?
is I don't believe in negotiating in public. I think that to be respectful of the other side, I think you have to respect that people will say things to you in confidence. If you're really good, they'll say a lot to you in confidence that they probably shouldn't say, but they trust you. So, and they get to like you. So they say, well, and they tell you a little bit about the weakness on their case and the problems they have on their side. It's human nature to do that, particularly if you're just listening, saying, well, let's have a coffee or let's have a glass of wine. Let's sort this out a little bit. On the other hand, I think that in this, in every day and age, but particularly in this day and age, people want to be better informed, and usually there's a group outside that's waiting to hear what's happening. So, I mean, as a matter of course now, I'm on Facebook, I'm on Twitter, I'm commenting on different events. This recording is going to be recorded, and you will send me the link, and I'll put the link up on my Facebook, and I'll put it up on Twitter, and who knows, 5 or 6 people might watch it, and then we'll be better off. But that's how it works, right? You're trying to communicate, but you have to communicate in a way that doesn't breach the confidence of the discussion that's taking place, because if you do that, then you've lost the ability to move. There's a lot of things that people will say to you in private that they won't say in public. And a lot of ways in which people will make a concession in private that they won't make in public because they don't want to appear to be humiliated, or they don't want to appear to be giving in. But they will nevertheless come in your direction.
Tell us about mandate. I mean, you are the chief negotiator for the James Bay area and First Nations. The mandate, how is that structured? Do you have to, are you under the principal agent relationship here?
Yeah,
Do you have to
I mean,
go back?
I work for the chiefs of the Mattawa region, as it's called. The chiefs are all 9 of them are members of the Council of the Tribal Chiefs, and I report to them. They are my clients, and I receive a mandate from them. And I think it's always important as a negotiator to know what your mandate is and what it isn't. As one of the chiefs said to me after a very vigorous exchange with him and his colleagues, he said, Bob, you're not a chief, right? You're not a premier anymore. You're a lawyer. So you might not agree with what we're asking to do, but that's your job, is to try to get it and to do it. And I was, it was good for me to hear that, because it was important to be reminded of what your mandate is. It's also very important to remember, because in the course of any negotiation, it's always easier for 2 people who know each other to find a solution, say that's the solution. It's much more difficult for them to go back to their principals, their clients, and say, here's what's going to happen. And if you haven't done the work back here, and you haven't talked to them, and they don't know what you're doing, and they're not aware of what you're up to, you're in deep trouble, because eventually you'll just get cut off, and you'll go way beyond your mandate, and it won't work.
Have you ever found yourself in a situation where the authority of the other side became an issue in the process of negotiations, whereby they didn't really have the authority that they said they had?
Yes, that happens a lot. It's often not so much the authority as it is people saying things that they think you want to hear. Because there's a dynamic in a negotiation where people, the guys who are negotiating are trying to get to a solution. And I think sometimes that leads to results, if they're not watching behind their shoulders all the time, it leads to a significant problem. The biggest case where we had a real problem, was during the Charlottetown negotiation.
Tell us about that.
Because Mr. Mulrooney was away in Germany. Mr. Clark was the negotiator and the minister responsible for negotiation. And we were getting down to the short strokes on a discussion about the Senate, ironically. And it became very clear to me at one point that the dynamic of the conversation was going in a certain direction, and I pulled aside one of the senior public servants who was working for Mr. Clark and Mr. Mulrooney, and said, is this really the federal government position? Is this actually what Mr. Mulrooney wants to happen? And he said, I think so. I said, well, we'd better know, because what happened was we reached an agreement on a whole bunch of things. Quebec wasn't there. Quebec then says, hello, I know what happened. And we then had a process where Mr. Mulrooney came back and was not happy. And he then reasserted himself in the process and said, I've got to take charge of this again. And so we ended up with a discussion at Harrington Lake for 5 days where we pretended that we weren't meeting, we were just having lunch. So we had a lunch that lasted for 5 days. We didn't eat for 5 days, but that's what happened. And it was one of those cases where it was clear that in some senses, Mr. Clark didn't have the full authority to do what he thought he did have. And I don't challenge his integrity for a moment. I think he
Assumed.
I think he believed that that's what he had. But I surmised that Mr. Mulrooney had a different approach to it. And so I think that's it's always difficult to negotiate where you're getting two different stories from two different people who are representing the other side or involved. That's always a challenging situation. And my advice in those situations is get that fact out on the table. Be very direct and say, well, I'm hearing over here that this is okay, and I'm hearing over here that this is not okay. So, can you tell me what's going on here? Because actually you're helping
The process.
and you're saying to people, let's really try to not being provocative or confrontational. You're just saying, we need to understand better what the parameters of this discussion really are.
What sort of effort did you put on your opening statements as you went into serious negotiations?
Well, I think it's important from the beginning to set out the not only what you want, but the principles behind what you want. And I think that one of the advantages of the so-called principle negotiation approach is that you are from the very outset you're trying to get to yes. You're trying to say, here are some principles that I think would be in your interest as much as they are in mine. Here's the way in which we can resolve the conflict between us. Here's how we'll establish the possibilities of a solution. I think the problem with too long-winded an opening statement is that it can take away from the possibilities of the solution. If you say, well, here's what I want, I need this, I need that, I need this, I need that, you sort of say, well, let's try to get to a better place here.
Where do you fit in terms of the agenda for negotiations? You're representing client X or a government, an agency, who's up against a formidable opponent. How do you arrive at the agenda? Do you send an email saying these are the 5 things and what 5 things do you have? Or is there a process that you
I'm a big believer in keeping it as informal as possible, except that you don't want the other side to dictate the agenda, and you don't want the hidden assumptions of that agenda to become built into the process. And so it's very important from the outset to establish your ground. Type A personalities who specialize in tough negotiations will try to control the agenda, and they'll try to control the outcome because they see it as a win-lose proposition. There's nothing, dealing with people who see negotiation as a win-lose proposition is a pain in the neck because nobody really ends up winning, and everybody ends up feeling badly about it, and it's hard. And I think you almost have to call people on that. You have to say, well, we're not going to do it this way, and we're not going to have big fights. We're not going to have temper tantrums. We're not going to have all this stuff going on. We're going to try to get to a better place. And I think you have to call people out on that.
I want to come back to that because you over the years have had to deal on some very substantive issues as premier and as your private life, etc. How do you deal with those difficult people. And what I mean by difficult people, yes, people who have strong ideology of a particular issue, and then those individuals who are just difficult.
Well, it's a real issue. I mean, it's a really tough because they challenge your space, they challenge your integrity. Sometimes the way you deal with it is by saying to the principal on the other side, I can't deal with this person. Like, you've got a problem here. It's not going to work. But if you can't do that, and if they say, well, he has my confidence, forget it, that's my guy, I think the best way to try to deal with those things is not by giving in. It's never by giving in, because as soon as you give in, you've abandoned the scope for a successful resolution. You've just got yourself into a win-lose game, and you can't win at it. So you have to use humor, but more and more what you have to do, I think, is just call people on it and just say, I'm sorry, I don't accept abusive behavior. I don't like all this swearing, or I won't stand for this kind of stuff. And you have to accept the fact that there may be, at the beginning, at some point, there may be a blow-up. And that's not the end of the world. A blow-up is a blow-up. It doesn't mean things have blown up forever. It just means you've had a bad day. And so you got to understand that there are, in every negotiation process, there are bad days. There are crises. There are things where people say, well, if this doesn't get resolved by tomorrow, I'm out of here. You sort of say, well, when will you be back? Because at some point, people decide if they're going to get to a solution, that's what they have to get to.
Over the years, we seem to, as a society, when it comes to conflict, we don't handle conflict very well. I mean, we grow up with conflict all the time, whether it's in the schoolyard or at the rink or wherever it's at. But when it comes to conflict in negotiations, I find a good number of people don't know what to do. And because they don't know what to do, the dukes come up and they becomes a personal issue. Have you encountered that?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think, there's a lot of animosities. I don't want to embarrass any political people, but there are some people who don't like other people in the room. They just don't like them. And so you really have to try to understand that dynamic, and you have to understand the risks of taking things personally. I think taking things personally is probably one of the biggest mistakes that people make, I would say, in life. But not knowing how to handle their own temper and their own kind of level of anger and animosity towards someone else is not healthy. And it really makes the negotiation very, 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 very difficult. So I think you as I said, I think we have to understand that conflict is inevitable, and the thing to do is to put it on the table, is to try to understand what is the conflict. Is the conflict because you don't like the other guy, or is the conflict because what he's asking for is completely incompatible with what you're asking for? And sometimes it's important to understand the nature of that conflict. I'm dealing now, for example, with the issues around treaties which were signed 125, 30, 40 years ago between the federal government and the First Nations across Ontario and west of here. And there are completely different interpretations of those treaties. There are people who say, well, the treaties were a secession of land, an extinguishment of title, and basically the First Nations saying, you won, we lost, goodbye, And First Nations' view is, no, that's not what happened. We agreed to share. We agreed to allow for a healthy relationship in the future, and we agreed to allow for a real partnership. So where's the partnership? And you got to put that conflict on the table. You can't just say, well, I'm right. Here's my view, and here's yours. You sort of say, well, and the law is a contested area right now, so see what the law is. And then you got to figure, but it's not just about what the law is. It's about how we put things into practice, and what are governments giving up when they do that. And that is really what a lot of what we're doing is all about.
Before we close our session here, I'm wondering if you could speak to students who may be watching the show, MBA students, undergraduate students who are just in the early days of their career, trying to get a job, trying to get settled, trying to make a mark for themselves. What sort of pieces of advice would you give to young people based upon the many experiences that you have and knowing what is out there today and what the future may bring for them?
Well, I mean, the first thing I've learned is that people don't remember the advice you've given them, and it sort of goes over people's heads. But I would say two or three things. One, the golden rule really applies. It really applies. You treat others as you would like to be treated. Once you apply that rule to how you live your life, it makes a huge difference. It makes a huge difference because all of a sudden many things become possible that otherwise weren't possible. Life is not a fight. Life is not exclusively a battle. It's about empathy, and it's about really living your life a certain way. And I happen to think that's very important. I've learned that. I've learned that makes a difference. If you go through life angry, or you go through life with your elbows up, or you go through life looking for a fight, it doesn't work. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. The second thing is your reputation goes with you. So think about that as you live your life. Always try to see things with a sense of humor and perspective. I think that's so important in life. And I think the other thing to remember is something I have also learned, and that is that no matter how tough it is, things get better. And don't allow a momentary setback to define your whole existence or your whole life. Reading out my bio, you mentioned the fact that I was not always successful. I was defeated, and I always like to say to people, I've learned more from my failures than from my successes.
We do, don't we?
And that's why I'm so smart. No, seriously. I mean, I think we really do. You learn from them, and they're tough experiences. I didn't like losing elections. I didn't like losing leadership races. I found it tough, and I didn't necessarily go around with a jolly smile on my face for the next 48 hours. But eventually, you learn that you got to get over it, and you can't let yourself be defined by other people. I think that often in life we read newspapers. We see people ask me a lot of times, well, how could you bear reading the newspaper? People were criticizing you all the time. I just said, well, after a while, A, you don't read them all, and secondly, you can't let other people define who you are, because if you do that, you'll just live your life in a corner, which is not where I want to end up.
Well, look, on behalf of the Ted Rogers School of Business, the faculty and the students, I want to express to you our appreciation for joining us today, sharing your insights, your experiences, and some of your tips.
Thank you.
In terms of going forward. So thank you very much, Bob.
Appreciate it a lot. Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.